Welcome to another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com. Now, as you probably well know, if you've been following me, that the last two broadcasts have been involved with the second of the three major discoveries that I made that greatly influenced the way I think and work with patients in terms of health and sickness. Okay, now this one, of course, is the one that most people kind of think, oh no, not more of that stuff, talking about nutrition. But it's not just nutrition, it's the quality of nutrition. Now, there's other issues, of course, but we're talking about the very basic things that have led to the downfall of the health of this country and eventually of the world. Now, the last time, we had gotten to the point that we were talking about the fact that it was really getting to be significantly serious by the end of the 1800s and into the early 1900s. So much so that things were really catching the attention of those doctors and, of course, many people who wanted to be healthy and really weren't too happy about buying into the modern medical thing that don't worry, do anything you want, it's okay, just go live your life, and if you have a problem, probably the only thing that will happen is some germ will get you. And when that germ gets you, don't worry, because come on in, we've got the magic pill that's going to take care of that. And you'll be right back on your way as though nothing ever happened. You can continue your life as you've been living it, and everything will be great. Now, you know, it sounded really nice, and as I mentioned earlier, the one big problem that had really a significant amount of awareness way back in, I would say, at least France, Germany, England, and the U.S., was the deterioration of the soil, which led to deterioration of food, which led to deterioration of health. Now, it's not enough because, you know, it's, as I say, I was blinded at the beginning. You just kind of assume if you grow something and you don't have to put a lot of pesticides in and so forth, or if you use, as some of the people in the natural movement talked about, natural pesticides, well, if you have to use any pesticides, there's really a problem that I eventually learned. And so it took a long time to break out of this box that we've all been programmed into, to begin to understand the real significance of the quality of diet. It wasn't just the diet, it was the quality. And the quality had to do with the minerals. And when the minerals are missing, not much happens. Now, you know, at the beginning, when they first were getting into, quote, food science, some of the first discoveries were vitamin factors. And they were kind of forced into that because of some of the gross deficiency illnesses. And, you know, we hear about it, we think, you know, that's something that happened way back. Everybody eats good food now, no problem. Well, it is a problem. It's just not as significantly gross as it was. For example, the scurvy of the sailors, because they had no vitamin C, eventually their bodies began to fall apart. And somebody discovered if they ate some citrus, like limes in particular, that it would supplement the vitamin C while they're out on the sea, and that it would get rid of the scurvy, which it did. And so those British sailors who went off to sea with huge stores of limes, referred to as limeys. But it did take care of that particular problem. But that doesn't mean there are not others. So we had others in the B family, some of the B vitamins. And we're not going to get into all that now in particular, other than to say things like beriberi and pellagra and so forth became significantly when you are grossly deficient. They found out the same thing with rice. When they started polishing the rice and making this nice white-looking rice, that those people who had depended on rice heavily in their diet liked how it looked. Instead of that old brown kind of ugly looking stuff, well, let's look at this nice white shiny rice. And of course they developed B deficiencies and started having all these terrible problems. And calcium, things containing calcium that we were not getting. Some of the children had terrible problems with rickets. Their legs were deformed and so forth. And it took a while to realize there's a connection between factors in food other than just saying, well, I'm eating a turnip, is what's in the turnip that makes the difference. Just because it looks like a turnip in terms of appearance did not mean that it had high quality interior-wise. So that laid the ground, and then we had the advent of Pasteur, or Louis Pasteur. I consider him the great fraud. I know that he's been talked about as the great discoverer of the germ theory, but all you have to do is go back and read the real history and find out that, well, maybe he wasn't everything that people thought he was. And then, you know, he had his family seal his research notes until long after he was dead. In fact, it was 100 years later that they finally, I think it was a birthday of his, that they released the notes. But it was about 100 years before his work actually was made known to the public. And it appears that in a lot of ways he was a bit of a scoundrel. He was a plagiarist. He didn't have the successes. He tended to tweak his research records for the public in the direction of what he was wanting to sell, and sell he did. It seems to me that he was driven to make big money, and when he borrowed information from another researcher who actually was a medical researcher, and of course Pasteur was not. Now Pasteur had some training in chemistry, but he was not a medical doctor or trained in medicine or the workings of the body. He was basically into chemistry, primarily inorganic and probably secondly some organic. But he did not know all the ins and outs, and so even when he plagiarized information from Dr. Antoine Béchamp, he tended to tweak it to come out in the direction he wanted it to go. And then, of course, as I say, at some point he tried to discredit Antoine Béchamp and have him thrown out of the medical society so his plagiarism would not be revealed. And so there was a lot written about him. Unfortunately, I would say they never got on the best-selling list because by the time he became a big name, and of course the French loved it because they got this worldwide recognition that this giant came from their country, so in honor of him they opened the Pasteur Institute, which was a research center named after Louis Pasteur. But I'm not going to get into that heavily. That belongs in another broadcast, other than to say because of his idea of the germ theory. Now remember, I've said it before, it was called the germ theory back then and still is referred to as the germ theory. Just recently I printed out something. And this medical doctor was referring, in fact, it was a whole section on the germ theory of disease. So there were a lot of issues, but most people don't know the dirty laundry of the medical profession. They only know the PR material that's put out to the general public, but they have no idea of what goes on in the background. All you have to do is really study the history of medicine and the history of pharmacology, and you begin to get a different picture of what's going on. And I don't mean way back, I mean all the way up to now. So, and we've done bits of that. You know, we keep putting out some of the information about how things are tweaked. You know, they do research. If the research doesn't come out the way they want, they discard the studies that contradict what they want to prove. And they tweak it in such a way that they can make it sound like, wow, this is pretty good stuff. And when in fact that's not the case, and so many times then the end results when it's released on the market are so bad that many, many people are injured or die from it. And it's only after significant people die, at least number-wise, and a lot of press. You know, if you don't get any press, you can keep it on the shelf, and that's what's happened with a lot of drugs. They were able to keep it out of the press, and even though they may kill 50,000 people or 100,000 people, it's still there because nobody's made a big issue, and a lot of times even the doctors themselves don't make the connection as to why something happened. And you know, when it gets down to cause of death, sometimes it's not so obvious what the real cause is, and so many times the doctor bases it on what he's known about the person, and will say, well, you know, he tended to be under high stress, and he tended to have some arrhythmias and so forth, so it looks to me like it was cardiac death. And so that's what goes on the death certificate. So you can't always, and I know some people who actually did a big study of that, and they came back shaking their head saying, how can we really put any dependence on cause of death when sometimes the decision to create the final cause is somewhat shoddy, to say the least. Okay, so we've gotten to the point that my big discovery was simply this. If you're going to have healthy, disease-resistant people, you're going to have to feed them good, nutrient-dense food grown in nutrient-dense soil, free of pesticides, additives, preservatives, and processing of all sorts that leave a hollow shell of food by the time you eat it. Those are two biggies: good soil and good food. Now, we've talked a lot about the food and a tiny bit about the soil. At some point we're going to do a broadcast on that. So I want to throw that in, I'm sure that a lot of people say, well, what is really good soil, and how do you know whether you have good soil? And there are ways to find out. There's two big systems that I know that are really significant. There's different approaches. One's just a purely chemical approach. There's an energetic approach. There's a very fine balanced approach. There's just a lot of things that can be looked at. And the two that I think are most significant, at some point we'll talk about. I've mentioned the one was Dr. Kerry Reams, who actually began here in Orlando, Florida. And he began as a soil chemist as far as approaching health, and then later went from the soil to people and worked out a program to then measure people and put them on a good program also. But it was again dependent on good food to feed them. So at any rate, this whole problem got so bad that down the road, by the end of the late 1800s, things were getting bad. We were starting to see things pop up that had never been a problem before. They weren't the same deficient diseases we were talking about that stood out, that got people alerted. But most people still thought more in terms of vitamins and minerals. In fact, the word vitamin, the originator of it, when he first discovered a vitamin, it didn't have a name, so he said, well, these vitamins are amines, which is a type of organic compound. They're amines, but they're vital to health. So they are vital amines, and from vital amines it got contracted to vitamins. So the vitamins began to be more important, and of course the gross deficiency of certain vitamins produced pretty gross symptoms in a person. So it's definite that those vitamins were necessary. However, without the cofactors, which are the minerals, nothing works. If you get into biochemistry, you see with every enzyme, either the synthesis of the enzyme or the function of the enzyme, there are cofactors that go with it to make it work, and those cofactors are minerals. Big minerals like magnesium, manganese, zinc, copper, and so forth. All these elements are extremely important for the body to carry out biochemical steps. Now, it's very deceptive because the onset of a nutritional issue is subtle. In other words, if you're missing one of the key elements, then a particular biochemic pathway cannot work. So it shuts down, but it may not be vital to staying alive. It just may be vital to stay alive healthy. And so you don't notice it too much. But when this biochemic pathway shuts down, that leads to the shutdown of another biochemic pathway. And so as you become grossly deficient in minerals, bit by bit, certain pathways shut down. But you're not aware of that. It's not something that causes your arm to turn purple and turn around 180 degrees into a strange conformation. You don't realize it. Maybe it might be over a period of time just a loss of energy. You begin to notice, gee, I don't feel as energetic as I did. And you may notice that your body begins to feel like something's not quite right, but you can't put your finger on it. So bit by bit, these types of things start to develop. And it takes a long time for mineral deficiencies to materialize. And so you don't realize that. It's a little on the subtle side. Now there's occasionally when certain things shut down, you know it. For example, the Krebs cycle in the mitochondria that make energy and the respiratory chain, which is interconnected with that. If you take cyanide, which shuts down the respiratory chain, and you can't make any energy, you know that pretty fast because it's only a matter of minutes till you're dead. So that one comes on pretty rapidly, that type of an interference. But if you don't have enough of magnesium, for example, that could be a cofactor, or zinc or manganese or copper, whatever the one is needed, only as you get more and more deficient, then more and more of the mitochondria shut down. So now it becomes more of a subtle thing. Whereas some things are gross and rapid, other things are very slow and subtle. And it's those slow and subtle ones that are deceptive because we don't realize, we kind of adapt ourselves. Well, maybe I'm just getting a little older. That's why I don't feel I have as much energy. So we don't have distinct symptoms. Now, when your body is working well and you get something in there that doesn't belong there, your body immediately responds to get rid of it. So what do you get? You get the old signs of inflammation, redness, heat, swelling, and pain. You know that. And sometimes the fifth one, which is fever. So when that happens, you know something is really going on. But up until that point, it's a bit on the subtle side, so you don't notice it too much. But on these acute things, that the body immediately mounts this big immune response. You know that. But now, as time goes on, your body becomes weakened and sicker. Then what happens? Bit by bit, things start to slow down, and pretty soon the immune system slows down. And because it can't work either. There's certain things that are necessary, certain minerals that have to be cofactors for the immune system to work right. So pretty soon the immune system shuts down. Now what happens? Okay, you get the same poison in your body, but the body doesn't react anymore. Now, see, the deception is that, okay, no inflammations, no fevers, none of this stuff, I must be healthy. I don't get sick. Well, as I say, if you take somebody who has had an organ transplant and you've loaded them with medications to turn off the immune system, guess what? They feel great. They don't think there's a thing wrong. I mean, they can eat anything, they can breathe anything, no reactions. Well, is that good? Of course not. When there's no reaction, it means no immune response. And when there's no immune response, it could be a matter of time. Do you pick up the wrong thing and your body can't deal with it, and that's the end. And so that's where the deception comes. And or some organ completely breaks down. So now all of a sudden you've got colon cancer, or you've got breast cancer, or you've got lung cancer, so forth. Bit by bit, as the body goes downhill and becomes more poisoned and is unable to deal with the poison, the sicker you're getting. And by the time you know you have a problem, meaning it gets picked up by some imaging or some sudden deviation in chemistry, and you say, wow, how did that happen? I was always healthy. I didn't get colds, I didn't get flus, never had food poisoning. I mean, I just didn't have any problems at all. How could that possibly happen? Well, it happened because a long time ago the immune system was shut down, you didn't know it, and you thought, for all practical purposes, you were doing great. And so you continued to do whatever you did. You threw in all the garbage you could like. You could go to get interesting breakfast at a fast food place, an interesting lunch at another one, and if your schedule's kind of tough and you work late, you stop and pick up some more, oh, what do I say, glorified garbage, and take home and eat it. You know, after that period of time of that type of diet, see, not only do they start out with bad food without nutrients, but then they throw all these enhancers into it to give it some taste, so it tastes like something, and pretty soon you don't realize it, but you're addicted to sugar, salt, and bad fats, and that's what you're tasting. And if you took that away from the food, it would taste like nothing. And how many people would buy a tub of nothing? Or at least it tastes like nothing. Of course, nobody. And not after one time, anyhow. So that's where we've gotten to, and all we have to do is look around us. What is the biggest industry in this country almost? It maybe is. The medical industry. All the different aspects of it. Diagnosis, treatment, surgery, organ transplants, all this drug after drug after drug, people taking 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, I've seen up to 25 drugs at one time. Their drug bill is hundreds and sometimes thousands of dollars a month. Are they more healthy? Of course not. They're continually going downhill. Okay, so there were people back at the turn of the 1900s, as they went into it, that began to see a problem developing. I've got so much paper here, I don't even know if I can get to all the ones I want. Yeah, here's some of it. Okay, so, as they started paying attention, there were a couple things came up. One was the increase in things that never were a problem before. Cardiovascular problems, cancer, diabetes, neurological degeneration, behavioral problems, gastrointestinal problems. All these things started coming up, and of course allergies and skin problems, etc., etc. I mean, all of a sudden we have a plethora of all these problems, and the doctors are saying, what's going on? I mean, here we are learning more. We found out these germs are a problem, and if we kill off the germs, everything should be good. So why are the people having all these problems? And so a few of the astute doctors started digging in, and of course they found out some interesting things. I have some charts that have been compiled, but we're not going to get into all those, other than to say, at different times, different studies were made to compare item by item. Now, here's one called the average mineral content in selected vegetables from 1914 through 1997. The sums of averages of calcium, magnesium, and iron in cabbage, lettuce, tomatoes, and spinach, which are some of the key things that people were eating. Okay, now, I don't think you have to be too good with eyesight to notice that here's where we started back in 1914, and in 1997, look at the average mineral content. Now, that's not kind of a little drift. We're talking about a major shift. I hope you can see that. Way back here in 1914, here in 1997. Now that's not good. Now that were averages, and this is stuff done by the U.S. government. It wasn't some guy that was trying to sell a cause and went out and did this. This was material taken from the U.S. government. Okay, now, let's just take one illness. As I say, we don't have time to go into all this. Let's take deaths from heart disease per 100,000 U.S. population from 1900 to 1960. Now this is only to 1960. I think they were afraid to go further. Okay, here's the deaths in 1900. Okay, look at by the time it got to 1960. Now that's again not a drift. That looks good. Okay, here was the one on the nutrient decrease. Okay, so that, I wouldn't call that just a trend. I'd call that dramatic. Now this again, this is not some private person trying to sell a cause. This is from government studies. I have pages of all this stuff, and as I say, we don't have time to get into them. But I will sell, for example, heart conditions, Mineral deficiencies associated with heart conditions: chromium, copper, magnesium, potassium, and selenium. Chronic bronchitis: copper, iodine, iron, magnesium, selenium, and zinc. Asthma: magnesium, major. Tinnitus: calcium, magnesium, zinc. Bone deformities: calcium, copper, fluoride. Now, not sodium fluoride, the one they stick in your water, but calcium fluoride as it occurs in nature. You know, all the difference in the world when you take a certain substance and combine it with another substance. For example, if you take cyanide, and remember we mentioned cyanide, it doesn't take much to wipe you out like that. Cobalt, you can't do much cobalt. Too much cobalt, tremendous problems. I think it destroy your spleen, your liver, your blood system, and probably the bone marrow. A lot of things could happen if you got too much cobalt. Okay, but if you're missing it, you can also have issues. So they all have a place in the right amount. And in nature, they come in the right amount. So at any rate, you take cyanide and cobalt, both extremely toxic. You combine them together into a molecule called cyanocobalamin. And what's that? Vitamin B12. So it makes a difference with how those molecules are combined together. So you just can't say, well, cobalt is bad, you can't have it, or aluminum is bad, because even aluminum combined with the right cofactors has a place in your system, but only in very extremely small amounts. Okay, so this just gives you an idea. I mean, these doctors were starting to notice all this, and they're saying, what in the world is going on? And there were some very astute people. I mean, just because it was the early 1900s didn't mean they were dumbbells. They were very smart people. And sometimes I think we kid ourselves in thinking we're so smart and everybody else is so dumb. That's not true, especially if it was before. We had some very, very sharp, astute, meticulous people, and they weren't being diverted by all of the social attractions, all the big movies and giant things going on, all of the TV and all of the radio. Some of the early people didn't have any of that. And they spent a lot of time in reading, studying, and paying attention and learning. So, now we got a problem developing, and they realized that. And so there were a lot of people who realized that. One was Dr. Harvey Wiley, who was a chemist for the Department of Agriculture, but he was also an MD. And he was beginning to notice things were going awry. So hence, why all of a sudden increase in cardiovascular problems that never were a problem before. And so it ultimately led them to the one I've mentioned before, Dr. Northern, who actually started looking at the food quality, and from the food quality back to the soil quality, and found that if you improve the soil and which in turn improved the food quality, the people who were chronically sick were getting better, and if they weren't sick, they stayed well. And so by 1936, it was recognized that, wow, there's a lot of people are doing well by eating real nutrient-dense food. And so a big article was written about these doctors, and it's called, actually, Modern Miracle Men. It was read ultimately by a gentleman by the name of Rex Beach before the U.S. Congress. And this was called, it ended up being printed into a government document. They were so impressed with what it said. And it was government document number 264 of the 74th Congress, second session. And this was actually around, I said Congress, it was both, I think it was joint, because the Senate actually published this. And anyhow, it just called Modern Miracle Men. And this is a copy of the actual government document. You can get it online. It's nothing secret. It's been around, but nobody's heard about it. And it said, entitled Modern Miracle Men Relating to Proper Food Mineral Balance by Dr. Charles Northern, reprinted from Cosmopolitan, June 1936. So as soon as this was read before the Congress, they actually printed it up into a government document. Did that help a lot? I don't know. Maybe a few people. But as I mentioned, Dr. Harvey Wiley realized we had a big problem, as well as a lot of other people. So they all got together and went and talked to their legislators and said we need to regulate the quality and adulteration of food and drugs, because he was watching what was happening with the pharmaceuticals, he was watching what was happening with the commercial growers and food processors, and the slaughterhouses. Those are the three biggies at the time that were creating some big, big problems. So every time they got a bill together, this started in the late 1800s, every time they got a bill together and they got a sponsor, all of a sudden the pharmaceuticals and or food processors would come in and make big donations to the sponsors, and the bill would die. And this happened over and over and over. And it wasn't until the early 1900s that a writer wrote a book about the packing industry and photograph documentation, etc., that was taken and shown to President Theodore Roosevelt. He saw it and he said, we got to do something. This is awful. And they were selling rotten food to people, which is ptomaine, rotten beef, and just all kinds of garbage, and there was no regulation. And they said, we've got to have an agency that regulates this stuff because we're going to kill a lot of people. And so finally, Roosevelt went before the Congress. He says, you are going to pass a bill. And by 1906, they passed the first Pure Food and Drug Act. Dr. Harvey Wiley, was made head of it. And of course, he was elated because that, as a chemist, and as a doctor, he could go out and take samples of food from these various sources or samples of drugs. He could take it back to the lab. He could analyze it and determine, is this stuff healthy or is it contaminated, and what is it contaminated with? And of course, he started creating havoc for both of those industries. They didn't like it. And it got to the point that one of the big ones was white flour. Okay, white bleached flour. They took flour, the grain, wheat, and took away all the nutrients, leaving only a pure white powder, which really works extremely well to make paste, to do paper mache, and to stick things together like wallpaper paste and all that. It's really good for that. But apart from that, for human consumption, it was unfit. And so Dr. Wiley took samples back to the lab, he did all the testing, and he declared it unfit for human consumption. Well, they tried to deceive people by calling it enriched. Now, can you imagine you strip all the minerals and all the nutrients off of it, and you throw back in 2, 3, 4 synthetic vitamins, and now you call it enriched flour? Well, anyhow, that was what was happening, and Wiley says it's unfit. So he impounded these big carloads of flour and said it was garbage. People could not eat it. And so, you know what? They went ahead and defied his orders and sold it anyhow. Now, I'm going to bring this up because I think there's been collusion all along. I think two industries intertwined and support each other, and probably the investors that make the big money from both of them are the same: the pharmaceutical industry and the food processing and commercial growing industry. Excuse me. I think these are the ones that work together. Now, I have a copy of an advertising page from the Journal of the American Medical Association. And it's interesting. This is back in that same period of time. I don't know, you probably can't read it, but that's the actual copy of the ad. But you probably can't read it because there's a lot of smaller print in there. Now, when you read this ad, it would be inclined to make you put on your rose-colored glasses, because who in their right mind could question white bread made from white flour or bleached flour? Who could question it if it's endorsed by the American Medical Association? What better endorsement could you have? In fact, the way it reads, I'll just read it to you and you tell me. White bread is wholesome. That's the title of the ad. Here is an authoritative statement about white bread, a statement that is accepted by the Council on Foods of the American Medical Association. Now, how much greater could it be? Okay, here's what they say. Quote, white bread is a wholesome, nutritious food. As such, it has its rightful place in the normal diet of the normal individual. Its avoidance for fear of any harmful consequences or the fear that it is the cause of any diseased condition, when properly used in the normal diet, is entirely without scientific foundation. Wow. When you have that kind of endorsement, what more can you say? At the bottom it says, an informative and interesting booklet for physicians describing the proper place of white bread in human nutrition will be sent you on request. All statements in this booklet have been accepted by the American Medical Association Council on Foods. Came right out of Rockefeller Plaza in New York City and New York State. The American Department of Institution, American Institute of Baking. Anyhow, there it is. You got it right from the horse's mouth. It's perfectly good. Now, when these people defied these orders by the Food and Drug Administration, which was just called back then the Pure Food and Drug people, in particular Dr. Wiley, he ended up finding that the companies were pumping it out anyhow, because after all, the American Medical Association said it's good, nutritious food. And so he finally decided to take it to court. And he did. He filed a big suit against the companies. It went to court, and of course, I don't know, I think they lost, I'm not sure, but I think he may have lost in the small courts because these were pretty easy to buy off. But before it was done, it went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and guess what? The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that he was right. With all the evidence, it was actually detrimental to health, and therefore was banned from being sold. Now, that should have settled it, right? Here's the U.S. Supreme Court saying this stuff is garbage. You can't sell it to people because it's harmful for their health. But you know what? The local law enforcement people, when I say the law enforcement, the attorney generals and so forth, of all the states where the big companies were, you know what they did? They took the Supreme Court decision and perverted it in such a way that they told the companies it's okay to sell it. And it's been on the market ever since. Now, in the meantime, Dr. Wiley was pushed out of his position with the Pure Food and Drug and was replaced with somebody a bit more friendly to the food processing industry and the pharmaceuticals. So, after he was out, he decided to write a book about the whole thing, which is what I mentioned last time, called The History of a Crime Against the Food Law. The amazing story of the National Food and Drug Law intended to protect the health of people, perverted to protect adulteration of foods and drugs. And he has the whole story in this big book. No publisher would publish it. I mean, it wasn't popular. After all, remember the American Medical Association had already said this food is good. So he published it himself. And once he published it, eventually he died, and for some mysterious reason, the family would not let go of the copyright and allow anyone else to republish it after that. Now, I can't say that they received some consideration for doing that, but it was very difficult. And as I told you, it took me a long time to find a copy, and all the way down to the other side of the earth, either New Zealand or Australia. I believe it was Australia. But anyhow, I finally did get a copy of it. But it was very difficult. Now, if you really want to find out about some of that early history, it's there. Now, we're running down on our time, and we are going to have to close down here pretty shortly. But some other doctors, I mentioned Royal Lee before, who was actually originally trained as a dentist, but he was a scientist, an inventor, and got heavy into it. And he was one of the first that got into heavy making some supplements because the food and the soil were so bad that he knew that people were getting sick. And so he's figuring, what can we do? And he developed a supplement made from organically grown whole grains and plants and so forth, and made an actual supplement out of it. And for that, he was attacked by the FDA, who was protecting the people, of course. And he spent a lot of his money, because he made his income actually from inventions for the dentistry field and other things. And he made the supplement actually for his family, and then his family told other people, and they told other people, and pretty soon everybody said, where can we buy this stuff? And so he ended up producing it. He opened a company to produce it. Anyhow, he spent a lot of his time in court and a lot of his money defending things that you take for granted today. And he actually, one of the writings that he put out a lot of stuff, was how our government subsidizes malnutrition and disease. Name was Dr. Royal Lee. You will find on Quack Watch, of course, that the guy was a crazy guy. He didn't know what he was talking about. He was only in it for the money and blah, blah, blah. But you'll find Quack Watch in the middle of everything that looks like it might be beneficial to human health. So then a lot of things were written as time went on, but before we get off of this, I just wanted to give you again something to say. Where are we? Because I've mentioned that in the U.S. we eat some of the worst terrible food that there is, quality-wise. We have some of the worst soil because we totally depleted it and have not restored it. And we have some of the worst health. Now, I don't have time to get into the differences, but there's a study called the average lifespan expectancy chart, which was something created by medicine many years ago. And I told you it has a flaw in it because it was skewed by the big flu epidemic of 1918. And therefore, when they first created this mathematical probability equation, now this is not factual, it's probability. Probability means you take into consideration a bunch of things, and then you try to predict from it. And that's what a probability equation is. It's a prediction, but it's subject to skewing and flaws and so forth. But forget all that at this point. And some people get confused between the average lifespan and the average lifespan expectancy. Two different things. But we'll just use their own thing. Okay, so here's a list of some of the top countries in the world. And since we are one of the biggest consumers of drugs and medication, and we have some of the massive food producers, we would anticipate that on this list, they went through all these different countries and determined what the average life expectancy at birth was for someone born in one of these countries. Okay, so since the U.S. consumes 50% of the drugs and a high percentage of the processed food that supposedly be good, then we should find them high on the list, right? Well, on this list, actually the United States is number 38. Now we find a place ahead of them. Number 35 is Chile. Number 37 is Cuba. United Arab 33. Puerto Rico 31. Number 1 on this list is Japan. Number 2, Hong Kong. Number 3, Iceland. Number 4, Switzerland. Number 5, Austria. Number 6, Spain. Number 7, Sweden. Number 8, Israel. Number 9, Macau. Number 10, France. 11, Canada. 12, Italy. And it just goes on and on. But here we are down at number 38. So there's a lot of other things we could bring up as far as death rates of infants, infant survival and all kinds of things. And quality of care. There's another study out on quality of care. Anyhow, I'm giving you all this to say that things are not the way it's been presented to us. We live under a great deception, and we were kind of sucked into it, so to speak, in a way that leads us to believe that we don't have to worry. We can just eat what's put out there as long as it tastes good, knowing that, of course, what we're tasting is table salt and table sugar and bad polyunsaturated fats. Now, again, we don't have to go into why those are so bad, but they are. So if you start looking around the world, way back, here was a study in 1927 in England, Diseases of Faulty Nutrition by Sir Major General Robert McCarrison, MD. So in 1927, he's writing about the things that are happening. He said he actually quotes Hippocrates first. It says, Hippocrates said, "It appears to me necessary to every physician to be skilled in nature and to strive to know, if he would wish to perform his duties, what man is in relation to the articles of food and drink, and to his other occupation, and what are the effects of each of them to every one." So anyhow, he's saying if you're really going to do a good job, you need to understand that what man eats and drinks. So, but this doctor, this MD in 1927, had been perusing, and again, we don't have time to read all of this, about what was happening with the health based on nutrition. As you look, there's so many I don't have time to read. By 1959, here is I told you before I read this is a Mr. King, a representative from Utah, that he was greatly concerned over America's health, and this concern now prompts me to take the floor of this great legislative body to say what I think needs to be said. America's health is in danger. This is 1959. And if the warning signals apparent to all are not heeded, we risk physical and mental deterioration and inevitable going downhill to the, I marked through this, underline it, and it kind of ruffled up the word, to the virile and more rugged peoples of the world. In other words, we're not going to be able to stand up to the rest of the world that's eating better, because that's what he was getting to in this. Another article, Pure Food, Pure Fraud. The Significance of Nutrition for Preventative Medicine by an MD written in 1953. Are we starving to death? Another article, this was in 1945. Medical Treatment, Nutrition, and Soil Fertility, Sir Robert McCarrison. He put out a big book called Studies in Deficiency Disease, which I think I have a copy here, I'll show you. But he's writing after that of what's happening with the health and so forth. In 1959, quotation from Roy Lee, "Scientists have been unable to tell us why these facts may be explained in terms of food biochemistry. Scientists have been unable to tell us why tooth decay is 1,200 times as prevalent here as in India. And scientists have been unable to tell us why Dr. Albert Schweitzer found no cancer in mid-Africa until civilized foods followed him." This was called Real American Tragedy. What else we got here? Primary cause of disease. And again, getting back to nutrition, the direct effect of malnutrition on tissue degeneration. The organs in the body deteriorate if they don't have the proper minerals to substantiate the rebuilding and so forth. And natural versus synthetic vitamins. Then they tried to deceive us into thinking if we ate these stupid synthetic vitamins, which were very cheap to make, that it made no difference. But it makes a tremendous difference. And again, we don't have time to that. Here's an article that was talking about Harvey W. Wiley, again, the original man with the Pure Food and Drug Act. He was the pioneer consumer activist. I mean, he really wanted people not to be eating this garbage food. A letter written to the White House when Calvin Coolidge was president, going on about the fact that the health was deteriorating in this country. War between health foods and death foods. This is in 1956. The National Malnutrition by Dr. Quigley, and this is in 1943, and he did a big study of all the health problems. I got huge amounts of underlining in that. All the health problems that came about because of national malnutrition. And again, this was an MD. Everybody thinks that, well, unless it's an MD, it doesn't mean anything. Well, the bulk of these that I'm pulling up are all MDs. Here's the big one by McCarrison that I mentioned, Studies in Deficiency Disease. You can see how thick this thing is. And this one was actually originally published in 1921 and later reproduced in 1945. Now, what was Robert McCarrison? Well, he was an MD, and he was also a DSc, a Doctor of Science. So that would be like a PhD in science today. And so this is out of Oxford Medical Publications, but huge amount of material. I mean, it's all there. And now in recent times, we've had another problem that's been confounded because now we have a big major interest in this world who wants to take over all the seed and genetically modify it so that they can patent it, so that pretty soon they destroy all the natural seeds, and only seeds you can buy to grow anything will come from them, and they'll only grow one crop, and then you have to get more. The one thing, of course, they're not telling you, and of course, fortunately we have the FDA, because they say with this GMO, genetically modified organisms, well, we're going to assume that they're safe, so we're not going to bother seeing that there's any studies made. Oh, now that is really looking out for the health of the public. Anyhow, there's a very good book came out, and I mentioned to you before, called Seeds of Deception. And if you want to find out the real story, that's a good one to wake you up. This guy did a tremendous study and showed you that around the world, even in England, when they decided to set up a special research study funded by the government that is going to show you that it's perfectly safe. They hired the best researcher in Europe, and they put a lot of money into it, set up this big study. At the end of the year, first year, all the animals died from the food, and the researcher was quite distressed. He tried to get the information out to the public. They shut him up, took him to court, Monsanto did. And finally, when it was all said and done, the government says, well, this guy must have done shoddy research, so we're just going to cancel the whole project, and don't anybody ever hire this guy because he's no good. Even though he had been an impeccable researcher for years, and that's why he was hired for the project, all of a sudden he's no good because they didn't like the answer he came up with. And it's all in the book on Seeds of Deception if you want to find out what's really going on. Now, I'm just going to throw this in and then we are finished, because we are finished. Not that we're finished what we have to say. We could have gone on for a couple more times, but it would be ad nauseum if we kept on going. I think you're getting the point. Bad food, bad soil, bad health, and high medical bills for degenerative conditions that are not a germ. The real problem is that the tissue is degenerating in your body and the biochemical pathways are not working because you're deficient, and therefore we have more and more chronic disease and organ failure. Why do we have so many transplants? Organ failure. Why do all the organ failure? Well, as I said, outside of the bad food, then we throw into that contaminated environment all the chemicals and so forth that we are given, high stress, and I shouldn't say millions, I guess millions. We haven't gotten to the billions of people yet in this country, taking ongoing medications made from coal tar products and petroleum products that have been synthesized into synthetic molecules, which they call drugs, which shut down symptoms of deficiency. Cardiovascular problems is a deficiency problem. How do you treat it? Well, you manage the symptoms with drugs until you can't manage them anymore, and the heart deteriorates to the point you have to do a transplant. I hope it's kind of clicking. Anyhow, I just brought this up. Years ago, it was found out there's different ways to help the soil and to monitor the soil. And one, of course, came out of anthroposophical medicine out of Austria by Dr. Rudolf Steiner, and it was called biodynamic agriculture, a system he developed, and they developed ways of measuring. One was chromatography. And so I was just going to show you, there's a book on using chromatography to even test your compost, because not all composts are equal. You know, just because you go through the routine doesn't mean that what you end up with is something that's really high quality. So just keep in mind that you need to also test it, and there's a way to do it. Chromatography is one, but you can also test quality of food and quality of the soil with this. And I'm just going to show you on the food, just to give you an idea. That, as I said, this is called paper chromatography. And just, if you can see it, the top row. Okay? The first one is basically ascorbic acid, which is called C, but it's not really. It's a fraction from C, and can be manufactured chemically. And a lot of the vitamin C that's on the market is all it is manufactured ascorbic acid. It has nothing to do with coming from food or being a part of food. Okay, the second one is a commercially developed vitamin C that's supposedly to be good, and you can see that there's more to it. The more complex the chromatogram, the more there is in it. Okay, so then the third one is one made from rose hips. Now look at the difference in this vitamin C chromatogram, which is the third one over from your left. And then the last one is one made from acerola berry. And you can see that it has even more complexity to it. So these you can do for nutrients, you can do it for soil, and you can do it for compost. And it's called chromatography applied to quality testing. And this is something that still can be done. You can take soil and you can take your compost, if you make compost, and tell whether it's really of high quality or not. Because they have some chromatograms in here and all those, and also this tells you how to do it. This comes out of, as I say, the people from anthroposophical medicine and biodynamic agriculture via Dr. Rudolf Steiner. We don't even have time to talk about all the things of him, but he's one of the great giants of the last century or two. Okay, I think we've given you enough to think about. I think we've maybe given you more than enough to think about. But I hope I got your interest in food quality. But you can't have food quality without soil quality, and you can't add it after the fact. It has to be grown into the food if you want the best effect. Now, in the interim, if you're really bad off, sometimes you have to take some supplementation, but all things are not equal in supplementation. You have to have a product that has real nutrients in it. Now, if you have poor nutrients, the body will try to take them and do something with it, which will be better than nothing, but sometimes even that can be toxic depending on how it was made. But if you get good, high-quality nutrients, you can supplement, but that's not enough to get your body well. You have to have it in the food you're ingesting, and to get good food, you have to have good soil, and hence, there's the, there's the catch. So I hope I'm awakening you, because I think you have a right when you're paying a high-quality price to get high quality to go with it. And you have a right to not be deceived, and sometimes even with organics you're being deceived, because organic, I've said it many times, but I'm going to emphasize it because I want you to know and not forget that being organically grown attests to the method of growing, which means without pesticides and herbicides, at least toxic ones, and tells you nothing about the nutrient quality of the soil it's grown in. So it can be free of pesticides, but it's also can be free of nutrients at the same time. So basically you're eating fiber with some coloring in it. Anyhow, I had some feedback to one of my recent broadcasts about good book lists. Now we throw them in as we go, but I guess we will, it's coming up It's probably going to be a couple broadcasts away or so, but we'll do instead of top 10, we might do a top baker's dozen, like maybe 12 or 13, maybe 13, of the top books in general, and top for like nutrition and food and health and so forth as we talk about it. Now, we still have one third thing about the 3 things I discovered, what has to do with quantum physics and its relation to the body and body function. That broadcast probably won't be coming up until probably 3 different ones, 3 more down the road. It would be the 3rd one, maybe. At this point, that's what I'm thinking. So, until we talk again, I hope you're maintaining your health, and I hope you're becoming enlightened to the point that you're beginning to get a handle on what's going on. Now, again, I say, I'm telling you what I have gleaned from years and years of research for the last 200 years heavy, and 300 years in health, nutrition, and medicine. But don't take my word for it. All the stuff I've told you, with the internet today, there's no excuse for anybody being uneducated about anything. You do have to watch. You're going to find conflicting opinions, and you're going to find those who are wolves in sheep clothing, who are being paid by other interests to get on and try to naysay everything that shows up, many times ridiculously. As I said before, I was talking about pulsed electromagnetic therapy, and so I was looking up some of the recent studies, and right in the middle of all of that is a note from Quackwatch saying there is absolutely no scientific studies anywhere that shows any value in the use of pulsed electromagnetic fields. And that is embedded in about 2,000 citations of universities, various scientific studies, product put on the market approved by the FDA using pulsed electromagnetic fields. And here's this guy, and I know who he is, and I'm almost sure I know who's funding him, because he hasn't worked in years, and he can't have a 2-story brick, very fancy office building and maintain that, and all of this garbage that's put out without somebody financing it, and it's sure not him, because he hasn't worked in years. So, and he's been sued, and there's been the court actually ruled that they had to pay huge lawsuits for lies, and it still shows up. So don't be deceived by it. I mean, you can go and listen to what he has to say, but then go and check it all out for yourself. But one time I was going to take his little blip, and I was going to put those 2,000 or 3,000, 4,000 citations of what he said there's absolutely no studies, and email it all to him, and just see what his response would be. But somehow I'm sure he would weasel out of it, because he is. When he's pinned down, then he starts to weasel. And so I'm not mentioning names, but I would say it is a medical doctor. But again, not a medical doctor that's out to help people, a medical doctor who's making a living being paid off to try to trouble the waters. At any rate, I'm just giving you that so let you know that when you're going to run into it, because every subject you come along, you're going to see one of his little blips stuck in there. It comes up on the search engine. But just watch for Quackwatch. There's a couple others too, but that's the biggie at this point. So our time has expired. It was nice to be with you again, and I'll be looking forward to our next broadcast. So in the meantime, be healthy.